Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is George Frampton. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on the future of Pennsylvania's energy sector. This is part of the Council's interest in the impact of the energy transition, not just globally and nationally, but regionally and in each state, our Beyond the Beltway work. We're delighted to be co-hosting this program today with the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. So before we get started, just a little housekeeping. This event is on the record. We are live streaming to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about this discussion and share it on social media using the hashtag ACEnergy and tagging us at AC Global Energy. Those participating in the Zoom panels can submit questions in the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Our panelists, whom I'll introduce in a minute, bring a variety of perspectives from their work in the Pennsylvania energy space. Pennsylvania has long been a center of national energy policy discourse, abundant in carbon fuels, important venue in national politics. And now under a new administration and amidst a global energy transition, the state's energy sector is going to change in some ways. So we hope today's conversation can provide some insight into the challenges and opportunities facing the panelists and others of you who live this every day in your business lives. So first I'm going to ask Jeremy Weber, who's the Public Administration Program Director and Associate Professor at University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, to do a very quick overview of sort of the past, present, and future of the Pennsylvania energy sector, and then I'll introduce the panelists. So Jeremy, over to you.
Great, thank you, George. I'm a native of Pennsylvania, and I teach energy and environmental policy at the University of Pittsburgh. So this topic cuts close to home, and I'm going to show several figures and some statistics that will provide context for today's conversation. All right, so many of you are probably aware that Pennsylvania is the birthplace of the modern oil and gas industry. But for most of the 20th century, Pennsylvania was not one of the country's major producers. That changed in the last decade when natural gas production increased 12-fold from 2010 to 2019, whereas nationally, aggregate production only increased by about 1.5 times. This reflects the development of the Marcellus and Utica shales, not just accessing those resources, but continued innovation in extracting more and more resource at lower and lower cost per unit. And today, if Pennsylvania were a country, it would be the world's fourth largest producer of natural gas. Turning to coal, Pennsylvania has long been a major producer of coal in the US. In the last decade, the coal industry has had a tough time nationally. Coal production has fallen 35% over the decade, but in Pennsylvania, it only fell 15%. This suggests that the state's coal industry has above average competitiveness in producing and marketing coal. Now I'm going to turn to wind power generation, where I'm sure few will be surprised to see that nationally, wind power generation has grown at a pretty rapid pace year over year in the last decade. The same's not true for Pennsylvania. In fact, wind power generation in 2019 was less than in 2013 in the state. The state ranks about 30th in terms of wind potential. So it's not a leader in kind of the natural resources for wind power production. In fact, wind power generation in the US is quite consolidated, with 3 states accounting for about half of all wind power generated in the US. And we see a similar story with utility scale solar power generation. Nationally, very strong growth year over year in the last decade. Pennsylvania, growth in the last 7 years has been quite choppy. And in 2019, the state's electricity generation from utility scale solar was only about 25% higher than what it generated in 2013. And as with wind, the state ranks in the bottom half in terms of wind or solar potential. And like wind, the solar generation in the US is quite concentrated, even more so than in wind, with 3 states accounting for nearly 60% of production. So these numbers give you the sense that Pennsylvania, like a number of other states, is quite competitive in fossil fuel production. And that competitiveness is not mirrored in renewable power generation. That doesn't mean the state can't benefit from growth in those sectors through the supply chain. It just means that there's an uphill climb for the state itself to be a major generator of renewable electricity. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, George.
Sorry, Jeremy, that's a great foundation. Thank you. In turning to our virtual panel, it's my pleasure to introduce, and I'll call on Rachel Gleason, who's the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Coal Alliance, Andrew Goen, who's been Eastern Regional Director of AWEA, the Wind Energy Association, now Director of Eastern State Affairs for the American Clean Power, which is a consolidated new renewables coalition. Catherine Klaber, Managing Partner of the Klaber Group, I'm going to call on first in a minute. Chris Lehman, President and owner of JK Mechanics, a major installer of solar systems and projects. And Hillary Mercer, who is Vice President of Pennsylvania Chemicals for Shell Oil Company. And we thank each of you for participating. So I'm going to ask each person on our panel to kick this off by spending just a couple of minutes citing the biggest single challenge, mentioning the biggest single challenge they see their business facing over the next 5 years and what they're doing to address it. Starting with Catherine Klaber. Catherine, you initiated the Marcellus Shale Coalition 8 or 9 years ago after working as a staff member in the Pennsylvania State House. We're CEO of the coalition. You've been advising shale producers for quite some time on business development, financing, and policy. How do you view the shale revolution's prospects in Pennsylvania over the next 5 years?
Well, thank you, George, and thank you so much. It's great to be part of this panel. And as George mentioned, I'm representing the natural gas industry here. I think by nature I'm an all of the above person, but certainly within market realities. And I think as Jeremy showed us, we have to notice, what we have and how to make the most of every one of those sources. But to really address your question about challenges, I'd like to first lay the groundwork that I think we're coming here in the Appalachian Basin. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that terminology, I'm really referring to most of Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, Northern West Virginia, where the Marcellus, Utica, and some other related shale development is occurring. We're really coming from an incredibly strong position here. Natural gas itself is an incredibly versatile fuel, and the liquids that are produced in a large part of this basin make possible the project that Hillary Mercer will be sharing with us. We're not just talking about electric generation, but also about major feedstock raw materials for industrial processes that we need throughout our economy. Home heating and home cooking, as well as a lot of industrial uses. It's a proven reserve here. Pennsylvania produced about a quarter of its own natural gas just a decade or so ago, as Jeremy's slides alluded to, and now we produce over 42% of the nation's natural gas. huge increases, very good rock, and the productivity per rig, in other words, the footprint is getting smaller all the time for the amount of energy produced. In fact, Pennsylvania's rig productivity, according to this week's drilling productivity report, is more than twice as productive as the next closest basin. So we've got good rock, we're doing a good job with it. And nothing will change with respect to our proximity to the very demanding markets along the in the Northeast and along the Mid-Atlantic seaboard. Very important for the Marcellus to distinguish itself just simply by where it sits. We've got a lot of new developments and changes coming on, and I'll touch on those real briefly. I think corporate discipline has changed significantly over the last year and will continue in terms of looking at not just more is better, but how do we optimize, how do individual companies optimize within the very low price environment for the commodity. We've got challenges with predictability. Pipelines are not getting in the ground as predictably as they were even 5 years ago, and that puts constraints on companies' ability to invest cash and communities' ability to count on that resource. The renewables that are coming onto the grid need to be balanced. We're pretty fortunate here in PJM's grid that we've got a little bit more room to maneuver, but I think any of us on this call would probably agree that that we've got to make sure and optimize and do that right amidst all this change. And then finally, it's been exciting to see how many oil and gas companies are leaning into to ESG. Those are a lot of things that have been done along the way, but this is a really great time to be able to showcase that kind of stewardship that's been a part of the industry and will obviously need to continue to grow. So thank you, George, for letting me open, and I'll pass the baton.
Thank you, and I'll have a couple of questions based on that too. Chris, as Jeremy showed so dramatically, gas has been booming for a decade, and while solar is growing at a rapid pace nationally, it's not growing that fast in Pennsylvania, although we have a new national administration that seems committed to huge investments in electrifying industry, electrifying transportation, and doing it through zero carbon power. So how do you see the growth opportunity? Are there growth opportunities in Pennsylvania for solar? How do they relate to the national picture?
Yeah, thank you, George. Yeah, pleased to be here today, and yeah, certainly pleased to be part of the panel. So thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, so I guess my perspective is a little bit, might be a little bit different than some of the other panelists in that I'm a small business owner in southeastern Pennsylvania. As part of that, we've been installing solar since 2009, so for about 12 years now. And as George alluded to, yes, we saw significant growth in solar probably between 2009 and about 2012 or 13 in this state. And then since then, it's been a declining market or pretty much a stagnant market. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we face over the next few years or 5 years or so is just how to make solar more affordable for our clients. When we have conversations with either business owners or homeowners, either at the kitchen table or in their companies, ultimately they want to know, what's the payback of my investment? And at the end of the day, everybody likes to be green, but we as a company have found that it seems like most people and most business owners are more concerned about the green in their wallet than they are about the environment. So it's trying to make solar more affordable. And so some of the things that would be nice to see is some of the at the federal level, some of the import tariffs that have been put on products and materials coming into this country have propped prices up a bit. So it'd be nice to see that repealed so that we can get a little bit more price competitive in that area. Some trends as we move forward. You'll hear things probably said about distributed energy resources and those distributed energy management systems. So that's how utilities can communicate with solar arrays or storage systems of battery storage within homes or within commercial facilities, so that it can kind of pull both ways and they can manage the grid better. So basically affordability, battery storage are opportunities as we move forward. And then coupled with the affordability is a more stable rec market. That's also a revenue stream for homeowners and for business owners to pay for solar. And ultimately, we'd like to see all of this add up to job growth for solar installers in this state. So,
Chris, thank you. Very quickly, do you do a fair amount of community solar? And do you see that, just a 30-second question, as a big growth opportunity or not?
We have not done any community solar yet. I do know that it is growing in popularity, and I do know that there's been some bid packages out there for it. So it's a definite, definitely has a potential in the state.
Thank you. Rachel, it was interesting to see Jeremy's slides. I'm not sure that very many people outside of Pennsylvania, if they were asked what state produced 40% of the gas in the country or was the third largest coal producing state, they'd say Pennsylvania. But coal has been a huge part of Pennsylvania's economy. And I thought it was interesting, Jeremy suggests that in spite of all the pressures on coal, that in Pennsylvania it seems to be doing better than the national average, somewhat competitive. How do you see the challenges of your industry over the next couple of years?
Thanks, George, and thanks for having me. And you are correct. I live in central Pennsylvania, and I think if you go east of the Susquehanna River, pretty much nobody knows that coal is produced in Pennsylvania. And if you go west, it's coal country. As you mentioned, I am the executive director of the Pennsylvania Coal Alliance. We represent our state's bituminous coal industry, which is important because Pennsylvania also is the only home of anthracite coal in the nation as well. So just north and a little bit east of where I live, we do have some anthracite coal as well. But nevertheless, our bituminous coal industry ranges from the producers to the manufacturers and service providers that support the operations at the mines. In Pennsylvania, our coal fields are home to very high BTU thermal coal, which, as you mentioned, or Jeremy mentioned, is rather marketable and high quality metallurgical coal. So we have member companies in about 22 Pennsylvania counties, and we provide $17 billion in economic output annually to the state of Pennsylvania. And as you mentioned, we are the third largest coal producing state in the nation. Our market is global, so it's influenced by both demand for thermal coal, primarily used for power generation, and demand for metallurgical coal, which makes steel. So outside of the traditional influences in the global coal economy, right now there's significant research and technology developments and coal to product space and the extraction of rare earth minerals and headway in emission controls and carbon capture technologies. From an energy perspective, energy can be more than power generation. It can also be infrastructure and commodities that touch our everyday lives, like steel. And although this forum is supposed to be on energy policy specific to Pennsylvania, I do think it's really important to note that we really function on more of a regional level. Right now, our biggest challenges are our governor is unilaterally trying to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, also known as RGGI, and whether or not he is successful in those efforts or if those efforts are negated by some kind of national CO2 emission policy. Power generation by coal-fired units in Pennsylvania definitely sees probably some contracting in the future. It might be more immediate if we join RGGI. It might be less immediate and over the next decade if there's some kind of national policy and everybody is treated the same. Either way, Pennsylvania is an exporter of generation, whether it be from what source it comes from. We export to all the other states that do not produce enough energy that they consume. So, as we've seen some of the recent events across the country, it's really important to have baseload power. The only two reliable and resilient sources of baseload power are coal and nuclear, and coal is the only one that's able to ramp up when there is need. So that said, I do see some transitions. I think there's also going to be some grid transitions, but going forward, we need an all of the above energy strategy, innovative emission controls, carbon capture technology, and other advances that we need to make sure that everybody has access to power all the time.
Thank you. Well, that's very useful. Hillary, you are a key team member for what is an enormous investment that Shell is making in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, this ethane cracker to make plastic. Like many investments in the southern states by companies coming into the United States because of inexpensive natural gas. But you're also part of a company that just this week introduced a fairly sweeping transition strategy for the new energy economy. I wonder if you could say a few words about how those two things fit together, if they do at all.
Thank you. Yes, and I can, and I'd like to do so. As you say, we have made the single largest investment in Pennsylvania since the Second World War in building the ethane cracker and setting up a new polymers business, polyethylene business here in Pennsylvania. That said, Shell's, as you say, a global energy company, and I think we see very clearly that the world's energy system is transforming. Now, in our view, it needs to accelerate that transformation, particularly if we are to meet the Paris Climate Agreement of limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. And we want to be a part of that transition. We've been around for well over 100 years, and we intend to be around for the same sort of time in the future. We do see power, the need for power growing, but I think our concern is that in providing that power, it's essential that that power also becomes cleaner. In terms of chemicals and the sorts of chemicals that we will produce within Pennsylvania are actually critical to that energy transition. Not only do they lightweight vehicles and are actually part and parcel of wind turbines and solar panels, but also other chemicals that we produce are also very important in terms of energy efficiency in all sorts of different ways. But what Shell did this week was it announced its absolute commitment to becoming a net zero emissions business by 2050, and also with some interim milestones around reducing our carbon intensity by 20% by 2030. And that's not just the emissions that we make, but it actually includes the Scope 3 emissions. So that's the emissions that our customers make from actually utilising the products that we produce. And I think that's essential because actually, if you think about it, the emissions that we actually produce from our own operations are probably only about 10% of the total emissions. So what do we see in order for that to happen? And we use our scenarios planning, which we've actually made available also to Pennsylvania, and they've produced some scenarios of their own to help them in thinking about the future of energy here in Pennsylvania. But what we do see is that there's going to be a very, very significant increase in the use of electricity, particularly from renewable sources. But we also see a need to increase, for instance, the use of hydrogen and biofuels as we go forward. In fact, we're investing about $2 to $3 billion a year as a company in trying to build up our ability to supply renewable energy around the world. We also see from a chemicals perspective that we need to increase the circularity of chemicals. Sending waste plastic to landfill is simply a waste. And so being able to actually convert that back and put it back into our crackers on the Gulf Coast, where we've committed to 1 million tons of recycled plastic going back into our ethane crackers down there to make virgin plastics, again, to create this sort of entire circular economy. There will be, though, the other thing that we do see is that there needs to be collaboration, because there are areas of industry which are just difficult to decarbonize. You think heavy industry, aviation, many of these things. And so we also see a need to massively increase the amount of carbon capture and sequestration, and also nature-based solutions to actually manage those emissions, which certainly for the foreseeable future, we will have to find ways to abate. But, what I would say is that US and Pennsylvania, I think, actually stands to be to benefit in this future. I mean, it'll be the future energy transition is going to be provided from innovation, strong technical innovation. And I think if you look at the universities and the things that are around in Pennsylvania and here in the US, that ability to actually provide technical innovation and entrepreneurship is going to be absolutely crucial as we see this transition of the energy. And the other thing I would say is there will also be a need for government and for policy in this space, both to support infrastructure investment, electric charging infrastructure, high voltage transmission, infrastructure for hydrogen, for transportation, etc., but also fiscal incentives in order to accelerate that transition and allow people to invest in the technology that's needed. So I'll leave it there. We see this actually as an opportunity, but also something that needs to be done and needs to accelerate.
Thank you, Hillary. And last, Andrew, but not least, as we've seen, both the carbon fuels, coal and gas have expanded rapidly in Pennsylvania in the last decade. The wind and solar, which is booming in other parts of the country, is not boomed in Pennsylvania. What do you see is needed for renewables to begin to assume some of that growth too in Pennsylvania and other eastern states, but especially in Pennsylvania? And is RGGI a part of that? I mean, I want to come back to ask Rachel too about RGGI, but does it make a big difference if Pennsylvania went into RGGI or not now, as opposed to 5 years from now?
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate those questions and appreciate being part of this conversation. I'm Andrew Gahn. I'm the Eastern Region Director for State Affairs on the State Affairs team at the American Clean Power Association, which you may formerly have known as the American Wind Energy Association. American Clean Power, or ACP, is the voice of companies from the clean power sector that are powering America's future and providing cost-effective solutions to the climate crisis that we just mentioned, while creating jobs and spurring massive investment in the US economy and driving high-tech innovation across the nation. So at ACP, I advocate for state policies to expand deployment of wind and solar in the Eastern US. And in that context, I wanna challenge sort of the framing that we saw in those charts at the beginning in terms of whether wind and solar are thriving in Pennsylvania. I think you have to understand this sort of regionally. The eastern part of the US does not have as strong wind resources, generally speaking, as the central part and western parts of the country. So I cover the eastern region. In the eastern US, Pennsylvania is the #2 state for wind energy production. So it has some significant fundamental advantages in terms of wind energy. But certainly everything that we've discussed in terms of the expansion of hydraulic fracturing and the expansion of the use of natural gas in the state says a lot about why other sources of energy have probably slowed in terms of their deployment. I would also just say that chart that shows wind tapering off. We did have a plant that was decommissioned in 2018, but I think if you expanded that chart to 2020, you would see more of a straight line due to the installation of the Big Level wind farm. In terms of the challenges, I would say price, electricity prices in general, based on that expansion of shale and hydraulic fracturing, but also policy. Policy plays into the conversation we're having on climate, on emissions, and on the future energy supply. And it hasn't been, I would say, a high priority in Pennsylvania with a sort of relatively low alternative energy portfolio standard compared to other states in the region. And I can come back to that and talk about that. I think in a lot of ways that's more germane than carbon policy or RGGI, for example. But just to give a quick overview of the state of the industry in Pennsylvania, there's about 1,600 megawatts of operating wind and solar capacity. That's enough to power almost 500,000 homes. Of that, 1,459 megawatts is wind. That has a significant employment footprint. Wind and solar together employ about 6,600 folks in Pennsylvania. And that's direct employment, including manufacturing. Wind and solar companies have invested $3 billion in projects in the state, and clean power developers have invested also in local Pennsylvania communities. Those projects provide about $2.6 million a year in state and local taxes, as well as about $11.4 million a year to farmers and other private landowners in the state. As I said, in the manufacturing, there are actually 30 different factories in Pennsylvania supplying components of the US wind industry, in everything from bearings, bushings, transmission cable, transformers and switchgear, brake systems, tensioners, lighting, mechatronics, enclosures, all kinds of manufacturing. And that tends to be clustered in urban areas like, your Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Philadelphia areas. There's no disputing that the low electricity prices due to the expansion of the Marcellus shale is a major challenge. But I would say, the state's alternative energy portfolio standard only requires 8.5% of the state's energy to come from wind and solar. And that's compared to states like Maryland, New Jersey, New York that are going to 50% and higher requirements. So I think you can look to policy as a major driver of the industry historically. And I think in the future, Pennsylvania continues to be a really good opportunity for the wind industry and solar. In wind, the turbines, as they get higher and the blades get longer and the drivetrains get configured for different wind speeds, we're able to expand to a lot of different regions from the primarily ridgeline resource that we have been focused on in sort of the past 20 years. So the fundamentals in the state for development of wind are still very good, and we look forward to a bright future of clean power development in the state. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I want to come back to the renewable portfolio standard and RGGI issues in a minute, but quickly, because Andrew, you mentioned the manufacturing of all kinds of supply chain, part of the wind industry. Chris, can you source? We have a Biden administration that wants to promote renewable energy and buy American, all American. Can you source solar panels that are made in the U.S.? Where do you get your panels?
The short answer is yes, we can source them in the U.S., but there are not a lot of options. So there's 2 U.S. companies that I'm aware of that are manufacturing panels here, Mission Solar and First Solar. I believe that there are 2 others that are actually headquartered in China that have open manufacturing here in the U.S. But there's not a lot of manufacturing options to buy panels from here in the U.S. So, and as also a good rule of thumb, we see higher prices to buy U.S. panels, even with the import tariffs currently in place. And so, in a good generalization is that if we can, most of the time it's a minimum of a 10% price increase on a system if we're using a US made panel versus if we're bringing an imported panel in. And we usually present those as options, but a lot of the times our clients choose the non-US version just to save the money.
So given the tough price competition with low gas prices, you're driven to buy Chinese panels, Korean Chinese panels.
It is, yes, it's price sensitive, yes.
Let me come back to Rachel and Catherine and ask you, Andrew mentioned the low existing standard, but Governor Wolf wants to go to 80% emissions reductions by 2050. If some standard more like that, even a very long run standard gets adopted, how does that impact the coal industry and the gas industry? And does carbon capture and storage then become a pretty important component of your 10, 15, 20-year strategy?
Go ahead,
Rachel,
Rachel.
let me ask you first, if I could.
Well, I am confident that getting to 80% carbon neutral without any fossil fuels will be next to impossible because you have serious grid and reliability issues. I will note that since I believe it's 2005, Pennsylvania has already reduced their CO2 emissions between 2005 and 2020 by 39%, which is a pretty significant number. I recently ran those numbers from the EPA CAMD data. So, I mean, again, we operate on a regional level. So emissions aren't local. They don't stay within state lines. So when you're looking at the PJM regional transmission organization and where those emissions come to, if I could link that and parlay into RGGI, that's one reason that RGGI just does not make sense for Pennsylvania, because it doesn't actually reduce any CO2 emissions. It just exports them to West Virginia and Ohio, where there isn't a tax on emissions. Now, as far as the 80% goal, I mean, it's lofty. We're in 2021. I can't say that it's not doable, but I definitely think there's going to have to be some advancements in technology that address fossil fuel resources if you want to get to that point.
You mentioned something, maybe I misunderstood, that a national, I mean, unclear whether EPA in this administration can really do a new version of a clean power plan under the existing Clean Air Act, but you suggested that a national standard might be more predictable and easier to meet in the long run for the coal industry than going back into RGGI and having this particular view.
Well, yeah, I think that suggestion is more focused on RGGI's. It's like kind of like a puzzle piece. It doesn't treat everybody the same. So, the taxes that you pay on your emissions are specific to your state, and they're not specific to the regional transmission organization which you participate in. So Pennsylvania participates in an RTO with West Virginia and Ohio, which are not in RGGI. Henceforth, all of the coal and the natural gas in West Virginia and Ohio will ramp up their generation for any displaced generation in Pennsylvania. If there were a national policy, although I'm not advocating for that at any venture at this point, it would definitely be treating everyone in a level playing field, more level of a playing field from the fossil fuel perspective.
Catherine, let me add to that. It seems to me that the incredible strength of the natural gas industry in Pennsylvania has, a number of clouds on the horizon. One you mentioned, that as NIMBY objections to new pipelines seem to grow, that's a real delivery problem. There are other, obviously, environmental controversies about fracking, but it seems to me that one issue that may impact your industry is the increasing interest in trying to have a methane reduction program. And in fact, the industry, API and big oil and gas companies have sort of embraced the idea that, if gas is to be a bridge fuel to a lower carbon future, they're going to have to really be careful about reducing methane. Do you see that methane issues as being a hurdle or a problem for the industry in Pennsylvania?
Well, the hurdle is in the understanding is just what natural gas development has done. I mean, Rachel got the numbers right in terms of the amount reductions in the last decade. But just recently, the International Energy Agency said that the U.S. has cut CO2 emissions more than any other country. And so, I think we go into these discussions about methane, as if the natural gas industry is part of the problem. But, I would posit that up till now, natural gas has been a huge part of the solution, but you don't really hear that, as part of the debate. With that said, the methane capture that is happening rapidly as we speak, both because of the need to get, to eke every penny out of operations when prices are so low. It's in the interest of companies to capture that much more of their product from escaping, but also, the tremendous pressure that's only been magnified with some of President Biden's priorities to capture even more of that methane. So we can't have a conversation about, meeting, carbon goals without having natural gas as part of the conversation. And I think it's incumbent upon everybody, throughout that supply chain to keep up the good fight of telling what's really going on with natural gas and not some of the, scare tactics that we see, pretty regularly coming out against it.
Let me pose this to any of the panelists. In Europe and Asian countries, the sort of adoption now in the last year and a half by a lot of countries in the EU of net zero carbon by 2050 has suddenly caused a huge increased interest in a hydrogen economy and the need for hydrogen for that last 20 or 30% reductions. Does any of you see that as something that factors in to your day-to-day business life in Pennsylvania?
Well, perhaps I can. I mean, I touched on this earlier, but we certainly see hydrogen as very necessary for the future, because, as I said, there are parts of the industry that are just extremely difficult to decarbonize without access to hydrogen and other, and indeed, as the last speaker said, there are needs in some areas where we will continue to see the use of gas and other fossil fuels, and therefore the sequestration is key if you're going to continue to use those fuels with hydrogen. And of course, you've got to think about hydrogen in two ways. So, you can produce hydrogen out of natural gas, you can produce hydrogen from water, and I think it's actually around the renewable energy that we will need, because actually creating that hydrogen is going to be relatively energy intensive. And so if you're going to do it, as I say, from water, and so actually coupling the renewable energy that we have and actually the infrastructure that you then need if you're going to have a hydrogen, a real hydrogen as really part of your economy. So it's hydrogen for vehicles, or hydrogen even for home heating, but for all sorts of things. But it's certainly an area that we think it will be difficult without hydrogen to actually achieve the sort of goals of the zero emissions by 2050. That certainly is our aim. So it's something that we're spending quite a lot of effort in really going down that hydrogen technology route.
Let me pose another question to all the panelists that is prompted in part by, I was going to ask, but is prompted by a question from a participant about, cites the fact that Pennsylvania is second only to Illinois in the percentage of total power generated by nuclear. So if we're going to go to net zero by 2050, nuclear is net zero. How do you see the importance of nuclear? We don't have anybody from the nuclear industry in this discussion, but how do you see the future of nuclear and its impact on any of your businesses? And maybe I should go back to Catherine, since nuclear and gas are really trying to compete on price heavily, but also ask Rachel the question. Catherine, nuclear?
Sure, I'm by no means a nuclear expert, but I did say, I mean, all of the above. I mean, I think what the challenge has been with nuclear is the financing. It's not a small scale endeavor, and we in this country have had a real hard time getting new nuclear plants permitted. But there's no reason, as Rachel said, that nuclear and coal shouldn't remain a part of an overall strategy, and very important to the baseload of our grid and many others around the country.
Jeremy, I think you indicated you had a comment, and then I want to come back to Rachel on that.
I spent some time in Washington working on energy policy issues, and we delve into nuclear. And so I looked at that in the case of Pennsylvania more broadly nationally. And as Catherine alluded to, the construction cost and the regulatory costs associated with nuclear have just grown exponentially over the last few decades. And that's resulted in essentially no new nuclear power plants being built. There's one or two exceptions that are straggling along. But it's an industry that's faced a lot of struggles, and that doesn't mean that it's done. In fact, there is, I think, great potential in these small modular nuclear reactors, which don't have the complexity and quite the siting issues. But it's a new technology. Until it's matured, what we're left with is an aging fleet. And while licenses might be extended, maintenance costs and regulatory costs will remain on that, hanging over the head of that aging nuclear fleet. So we're in a period here where hopefully there'll be new technology that has lower costs, becoming more widespread adopted. But until then, the nuclear power industry faces the struggle of just having an old fleet whose costs are not going down.
Rachel, wanted to give you a chance to comment.
Yeah, George, I would concur with that. I mean, much like the coal fleet, much of what has retired was older units. I think, you know, every single energy source has its own separate set of issues. Nuclear is very expensive. I know in Pennsylvania, I live just a couple miles from 3 Mile Island, and there was a disaster there, you know, decades ago, and you know, it shut down, but because it was uneconomical, because it had one unit, I mean, it just was not making money. It should have shut down eons ago. But outside of that, the nuclear reactors in Pennsylvania, from my knowledge, and there was a big effort pushed by Exelon, and I'm sure you guys have read the news behind that, and First Energy in Ohio, to get a nuclear subsidy in Pennsylvania, I guess maybe 2 years ago. And that didn't go through because there wasn't a proof that they actually needed the money. So right now, you know, they're operating on the PJM grid. My husband and I have an internal joke every day when we look at the PJM app that, you know, where's nuclear? It's at 33 megawatts. I mean, that's what it produces every single day. And it's very important baseload energy that backs up the unreliable sources on the grid, but it can't ramp up. So, you know, as Jeremy said, there might be technologies in the future for smaller scale nuclear. Right now in Pennsylvania, I think the nukes are doing fine, but it is important baseload.
You know, for all the panelists, and this comes partly a couple of questions from people in the audience about this, but the Biden administration wants, and the Congress is promising a pretty big infrastructure plan as an energy-rich state, but also a state with a very long legacy, historical legacy of manufacturing. It would seem to me that Pennsylvania would be an ideal recipient for the kind of infrastructure investments that go not just to building wind turbines and solar panels, but also carbon capture and storage pilot projects. Is there any kind of effort on the part of the state government or industry trade associations to say Pennsylvania is the place as an energy-rich state, to particularly a carbon energy-rich state, to invest in the infrastructure that is going to reduce carbon emissions and really create jobs and new technology? Is there any effort to have a Marshall Plan, you know, for Pennsylvania?
I'll take that one, George, if that's okay. I don't know that there's an overall Marshall Plan. I will say that from my personal perspective, we have a ton of met coal that would love to make the steel and build that infrastructure. But outside of that, we also have one of our companies in Pennsylvania who's beginning to embark, is finalizing a FEED study right now on a 300 megawatt coal slurry and biomass fired power plant in the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania that would be carbon neutral with the addition of biomass. So there are some technological advances that are happening in that space. I would agree with your assessment that Pennsylvania is a hotbed for manufacturing. If the governor is successful in joining RGGI, our power prices will go up, which will certainly hurt any kind of manufacturing in Pennsylvania. But outside of that, we do have the resources. We have U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh. We have a ton of manufacturing in the West that would certainly benefit from any kind of infrastructure bill.
And George, I would add to that, you know, there is a very important project funded by the Appalachian Regional Commission looking at supply chain benefits in the shale industry, and that obviously can extend beyond that. It's called Shale Power, shalepower.org. I would, you know, put a plug in for. But, you know, looking at the exact issues you're talking about is, you know, we can source even more from the manufacturers throughout the Ohio River Valley. And I think that's an important part of any infrastructure development currently and with a lot of potential future. And I can't think of an entity that's done more for kind of that regional supply chain than Shell. So I'll turn it over to Hillary.
Thanks, Katie. That's thanks for the plug there. Yeah, I mean, we came to Pennsylvania because of the abundance of the shale gas and also our proximity to customers. But certainly, I think in the things that I've mentioned already, I think it's clear that we believe investment in infrastructure is absolutely essential if we're actually to profit from the energy transition, and if Pennsylvania is really to take all the opportunities that transition presents. And I think of this in two ways. One is government action directly into infrastructure, as I mentioned, around upgrading existing stock and creating the hydrogen infrastructure. But the other issue, I think, is around the fiscal and financial incentives, which will allow industry and private industry also to invest in some of those things. Again, the way that's done, I mean, currently, for instance, you can see, there are tax credits for clean energy investments. There are also financial incentives for CO2 sequestration in the 45Q of the tax code. So there are things there, but it strikes me that it would help to have a more holistic overview. And I think one of the things that we did, I mentioned earlier, was we brought our folks who do scenario thinking and made them available to Pennsylvania and developed scenarios for them to enable them to test their policy and their investments against what the scenarios that they use to look at the future of energy or the future of Pennsylvania. And I think having that long-term view, and then thinking about both infrastructure, but also the whole fiscal arrangements around that are key if we're going to see those opportunities really realized here in Pennsylvania.
Well, you are a textbook example of how infrastructure investment could touch pieces of the whole energy system. Andrew, you had a question, but I was going to come back to you and ask you. I'll ask you and both your question and the question I was going to ask you, which is, what could the Congress, what could the federal government do by legislation or executive action that would be most helpful to the wind industry in Pennsylvania? And the question you posed was, how do we get, if we're really going to have more pervasive renewables, how do we get the transmission built that's going to take the power to where it needs to be?
Thanks for that question, George. Appreciate that. In terms of federal policy, like I do state policy, so I'm not an expert on that, but certainly I can think of a number of policies that are adjudicated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that affect the region. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that, but I think some of those changes that are fairly obscure, I think, to a lot of folks, could make a big difference in deployment of renewables especially the PJM region. But I do want to put in a plug for transmission. I think as we're talking about federal investment and infrastructure, and we're talking about reliability in general, I think that the value of expanded transmission really can't be overemphasized. Before the build out of the Marcellus Shale and the pipeline capacity that developed a lot of generation on the eastern side of that, there was a significant congestion issue with bringing energy, whether it's wind energy or other forms of energy, from western PJM to eastern. As that shale industry evolves and we see additional uses of that technology, as Shell was discussing, we're going to continue to face that transmission congestion issue. And that's going to constrain our economy and our ability to meet some of these ambitious environmental goals. So I think that's a real area where I would hope to see the Biden administration focus. And frankly, I would like to see more state policymakers focus on the benefits to the consumers and to those policy priorities of expanding transmission.
Well, you mentioned something that I think is an interesting hidden policy development, which is the notion that actually started in the last administration of FERC allowing our ISOs or RTOs to do carbon price adding in their auctions. Given all the discussion for 10 years about cap and trade, carbon tax, carbon pricing, clean power plan, none of which may come about as a national policy, the idea that carbon pricing would be introduced into the power system by FERC is something that not too many people are paying a lot of attention to, but could be an interesting development. Jeremy, we just have a minute or two left, so let me come back to you and see if you have any thoughts about things that have popped up during today's conversation that are new to you or interesting to you as somebody who covers this from an academic point of view.
I think my one takeaway from the panelists is that the energy system is very complex. In each energy source, is different end uses that to some degree are substitutable and some degree not. So we learned about natural gas being a feedstock into plastics, but also for generation of electricity and also for heating homes. And so therefore it competes with renewables in some markets and not others. And we learned about coal, that's used to produce steel, that's used to generate electricity. And so I think energy policy really needs to recognize those diverse uses and the degree to which there are substitutes of one source for another. So that was one takeaway, but I've been impressed by the concrete details and the diversity of perspectives here. And I'm thankful for you, George, moderating. I thought there was great questions from the audience. So thank you, and thank you to everyone for joining.
I see we have just a minute or two left, so I'm going to take that opportunity to thank you all for joining us. I hope this was interesting. It was to me, and thank all of our panelists for taking time out to share their perspectives. Especially thank Jeremy and the team from the University of Pittsburgh's School of Public and International Affairs for putting this together for us and providing some local perspective. And I want to thank Zachary Strauss, Kelsey Foran, Lauren Macedo, and the Atlantic Council events team for their work in putting this together, organizing the event. If you'd like to re-watch the panel or share this stream with a colleague, you can find a recording on the Atlantic Council website and YouTube channel. And I hope we can follow up with all of you and some others and think about how to do another one of these not too far in the future. So for those listening and participating, have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.